Welcome to the Innovation Conversation, a podcast about innovators, both in business and real life. Hosted by myself, Ricardo Pascual, and Harry McDonough. Today's episode is sponsored by Hyperskill. Hyperskill is a learning and training platform that enables people from all over the world to learn new tech skills. If you're looking to learn new tech skills, this is a platform to choose. You can find out more about them on hyperskill.org. Today, we are talking with Alexander Piskunov, a very well-known investor, about what investors look for in a startup and some very interesting stories, even involving the FBI. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Innovation Conversation. Today we are joined by Alexander Piskunov. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. Alexander, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for inviting me to speak to your wonderful audience.
Yeah, me and Harry are both quite excited about your presence here because this is actually the first time we have an investor on our podcast, and we've interviewed quite a few startups now. So we're kind of curious to find out what ticks all your boxes and what you're looking for in terms of startups when you do invest in them, but also how do you feel about the market right now? So I guess let's get started with a very straightforward question. Everyone's complaining about the market's really bad right now. It's hard to get investment. What's your take on this?
Well, look, I think that honestly, the markets are bad if a person does not know how to fundraise or how to do proper business development, right? So even in the down market, there will be companies who are still doing well, who are still, raising from the top VCs, who are still signing contracts. And actually, any kind of down market is an opportunity, right? Because you get to acquire your competitors on the cheap. You still get to promote yourself, and then once the market picks up, then you do get the opportunity to sort of expand it tenfold, right? So what I would say, especially if you are a deep tech startup, for example, because me and my fund we specialize in deep tech, I would say that it's very important to actually project much more carefully as to where would your money go towards once your fundraiser do have a big runway. And do not, try and chase after every kind of contract that you can potentially get, because otherwise it is unlikely that you would actually be able to cover them. So do plan your strategy properly as well.
Okay, interesting.
Jump in there really quickly, because I know at the beginning of our conversation you mentioned you want different questions thrown at you, and I want to make sure this is a free-flowing conversation. So it would always be interesting to see, especially as deep tech, and that's an emerging market. It's very, very hard. And working with some SMEs in the deep tech space, especially getting funding from Innovate UK, getting university funding, getting out there, it's almost impossible in the UK market to really get that funding because you need lots and lots of money kind of thrown into it, such as quantum computing. What I wanted to say is, from your perspective, and let's do a scenario here, if you were to be an SME, how would you get started, and then how would you approach an actual investor? So I find that quite interesting from our audience's perspective. Is something that's really hard to raise for. How would an investor go about it if they were a startup?
Well, look, I mean, you've mentioned emerging markets, and then you've mentioned UK. To be honest with you, Harry, those are two completely different beasts, right? So in the UK, yes, it might be more problematic, but there are also much more opportunities. For example, in the grant space, or when you are approaching sources other than venture capital for financing. So, for example, in the UK, you can raise venture debt. You can go to venture studios who are, supporting you, maybe not as much with money as they are supporting you with expertise, R&D, engineers, marketing, and in return, they are basically joining you as a co-founder, right? So you're giving away much more equity. But for some founders, it is worth it, especially, if you are considering deep tech companies or hardware, where, once again, R&D takes so much longer, it takes longer to commercialize. So if I was, fundraising for an early stage company in deep tech in the UK, I would, first of all, focus quite a bit on first of all, developing the MVP, right? Because for the investor, it's very important to actually be able to touch or at least experience the product. And even if you're not selling it to the B2C or to the B market yet, it is still a sign for the investor that by giving you the money, he would not be, trying to kickstart a train which is still, but he would just be, putting more coal into the fire. And obviously, grants can be a good thing. Problem with grants is that usually they do not last for a long time, right? And they're only one-offs. So usually, they're just using equity-free option by entrepreneurs, and it could be a good opportunity for slight self-promotion, right? So, for example, if the UK government or big corporation gave you a grant, it means that at least your idea and technology are promising and innovative. And then, obviously, if you are considering the traditional VC route, there are lots of opportunities in the beginning. You would probably still have to spend quite a bit of your own money, right, in the so-called friends, family, and fools round. Then angels, early stage VCs, you know the drill.
Yeah.
But in the emerging markets, actually, the situation is much more complicated because uh, in the emerging markets, very, very few people, such as, for example, business angels or accelerators, actually exist, and the majority of the money is concentrated in the private equity stage or the M&A deals. And as a result, at the idea stage, especially for deep tech startup, it's very, very difficult. And this problem is compounded by the fact that a lot of entrepreneurs, for example, from Eastern Europe or from some countries in Southeast Asia, they think completely differently, about their whole business development process, right? So what they're trying to do is they're trying to build as technologically sophisticated product as possible, not really understanding that there is no end to technological perfection.
Hmm.
And as a result, they're spending quite a lot of money on patents. They are continuously updating the product, and then they're just being late to the market by some startup in the UK or the States or even in Australia who just prioritized commercialization as a first aspect, right? So if I was a startup in an emerging market, one of the first things I would do is first of all, try and um,
Get some clients
secure,
and
try and secure, jurisdiction in a Western market
Mhm.
because it might, be slightly more expensive and it might take some time, but it's also a sign, for example, for the Western investors that you are being international from day one. While, for example, if you were, building your deep tech startup and then, mainly fundraising from the local guys and doing business in the local market, well, for the funds in Silicon Valley, for the funds in London, uh, traction in Vietnam or in Russia or in Bolivia, unfortunately, does not cut it. Right? So, there is no golden rule, unfortunately. Otherwise, we'd all be millionaires and billionaires.
So you must have a golden rule, if you don't mind me asking, because again, you invest in, I guess, deep tech, but you're also situated in various different countries. And having a look at your LinkedIn profile, you mentioned you're in Singapore. Again, that's going to the Asia Pacific region, which Singapore is very, very advanced. But then you've also had experience in America and various other regions. So I guess that takes a lot of knowledge, a lot of expertise. And again, you would have had experience firsthand into what sectors were the best. But comparing markets, which would you say is the easiest to really launch a deep tech business and get out there?
Well, I would definitely, consider the developed markets, like, for example, the United States or the UK. But deep tech, it's a huge field, right? It includes, software, it includes hardware, it includes AI, robotics, space tech, IoT, smart cities. You've mentioned it, right? And if you look, at the national trends, for example, you would see that UK is very, very good in biotech. It's doing great work in artificial intelligence, some very, very innovative startups in cybersecurity, in health tech. But when it comes, for example, for the consumer applications, right, in deep tech, they're not so great, right? In quantum computing, it's mainly the US startups, the Canadian startups that are leading the pack, right? So I would not, once again say that it's easy just by focusing on the big market to uh, arrive at a situation where you would just be, fundraising left and right as an entrepreneur, where you would be, having a great bunch of companies to potentially invest in as a VC. And even if you look at, like, for example, artificial intelligence by itself, you would find that, some subsectors within the wider market are trending quite favorably, yet others are, lagging behind. And this is a big problem for the generalist VCs who are, looking at financial technology, deep tech, at AI and whatever, and, just trying to invest in the low hanging fruit, because the likelihood is, they are not really as able to do proper due diligence. They're not as able to support their portfolio companies once they do invest. And usually, even if you are a late stage investor, you still have to wait maybe 3 or 4 years until you are actually able to generate a meaningful exit.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to generate that exit, you do need to, provide something other than the money, right? So the smart money aspect. So,
The
one of the
knowledge.
things that I've learned very, very early on is that, if you are, for example, specializing in healthcare, it's great, but you probably should specialize just in healthcare then, right? Because you do need to assemble the right team in order to do proper due diligence, in order to build up the right sources for deal flow and all the other things. And this is what COVID taught quite a lot of people, that, generalist investors usually don't outperform the market.
So let me ask you something. How do you get started in being an investor? Because I think that's something that always got me very curious, and I'm sure a lot of our audience as well. How do you get started in becoming an investor? Because unless you start as a multimillionaire because you have some family money, I'm assuming it is a lot of hard work, and you need to do a lot of research into this. So tell us a bit about your journey.
Well, great question, Ricardo. So look, I cannot, put my hand on my heart and say that, when I was growing up, when I was finishing uni, all I knew is that, I want to become a venture capitalist, right? So I did start, because, I'm originally from Russia, but I studied in the UK at school and at university. And just like the majority of the people who want to make something out of themselves, I started up in investment banking. After some time, moved to private equity. So that's a traditional finance career.
Mm-hmm.
And, what excited me back then was, not the salary, even though it was great. It was an opportunity to do exciting deals all over the world. And I did get to network quite a bit with entrepreneurs. And what became really interesting is to understand, how does it make their decisions, what it takes to, spin an idea stage company into a mid-sized business. So I left to start up my own company.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, I was not a tech guy. It only came later. So my company dealt with wine imports from exotic countries into the restaurant and bar industry back in the UK. Sold it when Brexit came, and decided that I just don't want to deal with manufacturing, real estate, and tech M&A anymore. I
Mm-hmm.
want to do something much more meaningful. So I took my financial experiences, I took my experiences as an entrepreneur, and I moved to Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And I started to work much more with early stage guys who, yes, they had burning eyes and great passion, but not much more than that, unfortunately, right? So when I joined a fund in the US, we were focusing more on the earlier stage deals, so that seed and Series A.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it was very exciting, because I think that was a time when I uh, started to receive the craziest deals that I ever saw. And, the kind of deals that you can, put up on your wall and smile every time that you um, walk nearby, because you just cannot dream of them even in your, craziest dream. But, that Silicon Valley for you, that's where, the majority of the innovations get born and die eventually. And that was part of the fun. So, just like I decided that things need to change when Brexit came, COVID also made me reconsider some of my options. So I moved over to Singapore and, started up the fund where I work right now. And back when I was in the States, we did early stage deals. Right now, we're focusing on the later stage ones. And to be honest with you guys, I must say that, especially in the smart money aspect, it's much more meaningful to run a late stage fund, because you're not just, simply helping out with key introductions, or helping to make C-level hires or product validation, but it's much more to do with late stage M&As, international expansion, fundraising, and whatnot. So the actual hands-on aspect is much more interesting, and as a result, there is much more in terms of actually being able to justify your equities that you're trying to ask in return.
Interesting. All right, I got to ask you this one. This is a bit of a wild card, but when you're all this investing, moving to Silicon Valley, did you have the world famous gilet or the vest that investors are known for, or not? Is that part of the uniform, or there's no such thing?
Well, look, very interesting question. It's just a stereotype, and I think that it's very, very important to dress and act the part who your clients are, right? So, as a venture capitalist, everybody goes in thinking that, hey, I'll be this rich tech guy, I'll be my own boss. Unfortunately, you're still responsible to many people. One of the groups is obviously your LPs, right? The investors into the fund.
Yeah.
And usually they're quite conservative, right? So, for example, at our fund, we are not looking into some sectors which could be questionable, like, for example, blockchain or, crypto or vice tech and things like that, because a lot of those startups are associated with hype, some others are associated with scams, and overall, often case, the actual financial motivations are quite questionable with a lot of entrepreneurs. And the second group that you as a VC are partly responsible to, right, are your portfolio companies or potential portfolio companies, right? So the entrepreneurs. And especially if you look at hotbeds of innovation, like, for example, in London or in Silicon Valley, you get to deal, with the tech bros, right? Who are not, Patagonia vest suited. They're, hoodie, sweatpants, sometimes quite stylish, other times, much less so. But if you are donning the Brioni suits or loafers, they would just not understand you, right? So you do have to present yourself in a different manner.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because obviously we've had plenty of guests so far, and I think one of the issues that people always have on the back of their minds is how well will they integrate with the individual they're talking to, right? Do they dress the part? Do they not dress the part? Are they coming in with is it like tech bro mood, or is it completely different? And I think that's always something that you find in a lot of entrepreneurs, is that kind of imposter syndrome. So let me ask you this: Do you find that people, when they go to speak with investors and network and all that, do you spot straight away, okay, this person is very nervous, they have a bit of an imposter syndrome? Or quite on the contrary, you find that most entrepreneurs actually are able to correctly articulate their ideas and their companies?
Well, look, I mean, we are not, having a checklist which lists different kind of syndromes as potential, red flags for rejection. And we do understand that, especially in the big hubs, like once again, London or Silicon Valley or New York or Germany, you get entrepreneurs from all over the world who sometimes don't, speak English as a native language, who sometimes are much more technically oriented. And as a result, they are more shy when it comes to dealing with people. And, often case, for example, right now, as we're a late stage fund, it's still much more, about the actual financial revenue that they do have, about their forecast, about their contracts, about, how well can the existing product be spun out into product line. While, for example, if we were, if I was, still working at that early stage fund, obviously, if a CEO is quite awkward around people, it's a bad thing, because it does mean that, it will be more difficult for him not only to fundraise, but also to sell to the potential clients. But for example, if it was, a chief technical officer, then perhaps it's not such a big problem because we understand that, a great team is a team that complements each other. But, still, once again, if it's a consumer-facing product, then being able to articulate yourself is much more important. But also, what is important is, for example, if you maybe don't really communicate as well, but you have great traction, or you are a serial entrepreneur, then it counts much more, because for us it's a sign that maybe you don't really know how to spell it eloquently, right? But once it comes to the business, then you know your stuff, and that's much more important.
Interesting.
The other question, I just want to go on to that one. You mentioned about your later stage fund. What kind of check sizes do you throw out there?
Oh, it's in the dozens of millions.
And then do you also follow the process of you go on lead investor approach? So as long as that individual has a lead investor, you follow it, or do you kind of throw out all the cash into them straight away?
Well, we occasionally lead our deals. Sometimes, because we are already investing in deals which are quite well known. Sometimes we do prefer the round to be led, by a huge investor, which for us, it's not only a sign of quality, but it's also an opportunity for them to sort of bear the brunt of the work and the risk. But when it comes to leading the round, obviously it's much more beneficial, because not only we do get an opportunity to take more equity, but also it's much more meaningful when it comes to, for example, to the board presence or to the public attention. So it's a better opportunity for us to showcase, for example, to our LPs in the fund that, hey, we were the right avenue for your money.
And then just going off that as well, again, being a lead investor, you get the lion's share, you get more equity on that side. But I just want to throw it out there. You've all seen the story of WeWork and how great that was with SoftBank putting a lot of money into it, and and Adam Newman kind of doing his own bits and pieces. Have you got similar stories to that? If you don't mind sharing, has anybody ever done something similar to any of the companies you've invested in, or has it anything cautionary tales? Or that'd be quite
interesting. Adam Newman, very interesting guy. Obviously you can say a lot about him, but what you cannot deny is that this guy knows how to fundraise and this guy knows how to sell, right? And he does present a clear picture how to revolutionize an industry, namely the real estate industry, which is very, very old-fashioned in its current nature, and it's huge in terms of the market size, right? So this is why, yes, WeWork flopped. Yes, Masayoshi very, very unhappy. But Adam Newman, he still fundraised for his second venture, right? Yeah. Because he did not lie outright, even though he did, make some claims which are quite bold. But unlike, for example, Elizabeth Holmes and Tyrannus, he did not lie outright. So now she's in jail, and he's living the entrepreneur life. Let's just say that. Look, I think that every investor has their own cautionary tales. For example, one of, let's say, the horror stories that I've personally dealt with was when I was still working at the US fund, and we were considering an investment in an entrepreneur whose business, whose contracts, whose patents, and whose, general demeanor were very, very promising. So he had, great experience in major corporations. He had a bunch of contracts probably under his name. He had, a team which was very, very developed. So we originally liked it. We started to do due diligence, and somebody gave us a hint that, perhaps we should hire a private investigator. And, to give you guys a perspective, this is something that does not happen very often. So we hired that investigator, and he came back after a week or so to us, and he said, hey, this guy might be great, but he changed his name. Under the previous name, he is wanted by the FBI for stealing a bunch of, trade secrets from his employer. Several contracts that he claimed are fake, and perhaps
Wow.
best not to be associated with him, right? So we rejected the deal. After some time, he got put in prison, right? So, I mean, look, that's Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is a place where there is just so much free money floating around that you are considered a fool as an investor, not when you gave the money to a company which eventually flopped, but if you did not give the money to a company which eventually, had a hockey stick kind of growth, right?
Mm.
So this is one of the major comparisons. For example, if you look at Silicon Valley and look at emerging markets, right? So, and if you are an entrepreneur, on the other hand, once again, you are much more reviled in the society, not when you lied or when you exaggerated the truth, right? To put it this way, but when you exaggerated the truth and got caught, right? So once again, slightly different attitude to innovation, and it's not bad. It's just a different way of doing things, I suppose, right? Because without it, I suppose Silicon Valley would not have become the place which it is now. And there are good things and there are bad things, just like in any other kind of innovation ecosystem.
I just want to throw over to
Would you?
Ricardo very shortly. I just got one last thing I want to get out there. A lot of the stuff we see online on LinkedIn is always about startups saying how investors have rejected me or not replied, and they all say the startup community is really, really small, and we all talk and we want to say this is a bad investor, this is a good investor, I really like this one. So from what you've mentioned there, would you say the investor community is very small? And what you've gone on about this guy line, I presume it's near impossible for him to ever raise investment again. Is that the case?
Well, of course, look, I mean, if you look at any kind of investment or innovation ecosystem, the community is always very small. Like, for example, in Silicon Valley, it's multiplied by hundredfold, right? Because, as an investor, you are always attending the same events. You are, going to gym or, to the nightlife in the same places. And ultimately, you do get to collaborate on due diligence or on deal flow sharing or on many other aspects of the overall work process. So you do get to exchange opinions. And this is why for entrepreneurs, it's very, very important to, present themselves quite cautiously. But it's also very important to do proper due diligence on the investors, right? So do talk to existing portfolio companies to see, how exactly helpful was the investor in relation to what they claim, what kind of red flags, what kind of, you know, uh, investor base do they have, and things like that. So do take an opportunity to sort of do your own due diligence and do not neglect it, because otherwise, you might be facing a problem, but it would be once, he's already on your cap table, which is not a good situation to be in.
Yep. So, what type of red flags would you point out that for you are like a no go? And the moment you find them, obviously, apart from being wanted by the FBI, which is a massive thing, which are the ones that say, okay, if this is not there, I'm not going to invest, or I think it's a massive red flag. It's like, can I ask for the top 5 or maybe top 3? The ones who say, you know what, it doesn't work for me at all.
Well, look, I mean, it's a broad question. It does depend on the stage. So, for example, when I was working at an early stage fund, one of the red flags for us was if the entrepreneur is a solo founder, right? Because we do understand that, there are only 24 hours in a day. No matter how bright you are, quite unlikely, just by the law of numbers, that you would be able to do everything just by yourself. Um, Other than that, on the earlier stages, red flags are, for example, if you are, let's say, once again, if we go to the deep tech space, if you are at an early stage, spending too much time and effort to um, allocate on patents, right? Because we do understand that, patents at an early stage can be circumvented quite easily. And
Mm-hmm.
once you are in the public space, unless, you have the right set of investors and corporate clients, then it's quite likely that a bunch of others can just, circumvent the technology. So, and, at the same time, the patents, they take quite a long time to secure, especially if you're talking about the international ones, and they can be quite costly, which is the money that perhaps, you should be spending on business development or early marketing or, hiring, early team members. While if you're, for example, looking at the later stages, then, one of the red flags that we do look at right now, for example, is when there is no alignment between us as investors and the founding team as to the strategy, the medium and long-term strategy as to how the company should develop, right? Like, for example, if they are a company based out of Singapore and, they are looking to expand to the States, but we and the other investors think that, first of all, States is a great market, but first of all, they should be, focusing on the expansion, for example, in the Southeast Asian region, maybe go to China, maybe go to the emerging markets like Vietnam and Malaysia. And this is a big red flag because, even though at later stages investors do have much more equity than sometimes the entrepreneurs do, still the entrepreneurs are the public face of the company, and still quite a lot depend, on their own vision and their ability to deliver. And this is why, when a company grows up a bit, stops becoming an early stage company and reaches its growth stage, quite a few investors like to replace the original CEO because they do understand that, hey, this original guy, he might have had the great vision, but he is not as great, when it comes to strategic expansion and negotiation of contracts. And if you look at the developed markets, then for the entrepreneurs, it's not a problem, right? Because they do understand that it would still be, walking away with a sizable chunk of equity, and they would be, treated as almost like a startup royalty because they would be considered serial entrepreneurs if they do look at, founding the next venture, which for them would be much easier to fundraise for because they have already proven themselves. While if you look at the emerging market, then the attitude is much more difficult because the entrepreneurs there, they're considering their startup to be sort of almost their baby, and as a result, they are much less willing to actually, relinquish their reins of power. So that could cause some conflict.
I got another follow-up. It's the same type of area. But would you advise a company from the UK to try and go and seek investment in the US? Reason being is a lot of the startups we talk with, they actually don't ask for that much money. I mean, the max ticket size they normally go for, or the first round they go for, is around 250K. That has to do with that whole SEIS thing. However, if you look at the US market, it's normally quite higher. Like Seed is normally around $1 million. Would you advise anyone in the case say, hey, why don't you just take a flight to San Francisco and try and raise some money there, because you get a lot more money and you can play around a lot more with that money. It gives you a much longer runway. Or not at all, and just say actually focus on your existing market and trying to raise investment from your local investors?
Well, look, I mean, I think that it does depend on, once again, are you a serial entrepreneur? What's your network like, right? Because yes, in Silicon Valley or in New York, the valuations sometimes, and, that's not always the case, sometimes they are higher than in London. But, it does take much more time and effort for you to travel between London and San Francisco. It does take much more time and effort to build up your network from scratch. And you would still be considered an outsider, even if you are a great company based out of London, unless you have taken some active steps to, get integrated into the local system. So, for example, how you can do it, maybe you can go through the local acceleration program like Y Combinator, right? Maybe you can try and secure financing from the branch of a VC fund that you fundraise from in London, if they do have offices, for example, in San Francisco and New York. But in general, I would say that the best thing for you as an entrepreneur would be to focus on a market where the majority of your customers are currently based in, and where your legal jurisdiction is, right? Because, for example, in terms of the legal jurisdiction, it's much more understandable and convenient for the investors to deal with you on the fundraising aspect if they have, for example, the majority of the other portfolio companies in that they have dealt with are in the similar jurisdiction, right? Because they understand better how to do proper term sheets with you as well. They understand some potential red flags or problems that can arise, and as a result, they are much more willing to trust you, or on their own side to do due diligence on you because you would be reporting under the same guidelines. And at the same time, when it comes to the clients, also, if you are fundraising from the US and the majority of your clients are from the UK, yes, it's easier than if the clients of yours, they were from Malaysia or from Ukraine, for example. But, because of the similar purchasing power and consumer habits between the US and the UK, but they're not the same, right? And the US investors understand that, right? So they are looking for traction on their local market. So what I would advise you, unless you're a serial entrepreneur who already knows how it's done and who already has a network, is to go and fundraise from the States if you're a UK-based company. Once you're in the growth stage, right? So, for example, you've conquered the UK market. Maybe you are considering expansion to Europe. Maybe you're considering the expansion to the States. And what exactly do you want from the UK or from the US guys when it comes to the smart money aspect? And once you have that sorted, then do go and fundraise there.
Did you jump in though? How does the fundraising compare from the US to the UK and to, let's say, Africa and China? Because with the UK, they've just relaunched, or haven't relaunched it, but they've just extended let's say, the deadline for SCIS and EIS to 2030 or 2035. So this gives investors more security, more aspects to, play with their money, tax incentives. Is there something similar to that in America? And then following on from that, if you look at countries like Africa, a lot of the money in Africa, or the investment that comes into Africa, is from the US, but a lot of it's often held in offshore accounts because of, obviously, let's say, country regulations or corruption in other areas as well. And then you also mentioned about China. How do those fundraising journeys differ from, let's say, if I was to do one in America, I was to do one in the UK, and maybe if I was to do one in Africa or China, because they're very harsh markets and there's a lot of tension between all of them, I'd say.
Well, look, I mean, if you're talking about Africa, for example, I would say that it's quite difficult for American and British investors, for example, in the VC space, to actually consider Africa properly, because quite a few countries they're not as sophisticated when it comes to the level of infrastructure development, when it comes to the consumer preference, and when it comes to their ability to actually pay for that product. And also it's quite difficult in Africa to grow a company from idea stage all the way to a public company. So it takes much longer and is more difficult for an investor to actually make a meaningful exit. So usually when it comes to Africa, you would not perhaps, see the deep tech companies doing well. You would see the companies in the impact space doing well, right? So maybe financial services, maybe, ride sharing, or, electricity or clean water. So things basically which are, already solved for many decades in the West, but, they're still a big problem for the emerging countries in Africa. And to be honest, it's not, only applicable to, deep Africa. It's also to a certain extent applicable to even the spots like, for example, South Africa, right? Because they're still facing quite a few of the similar problems as the rest of the continent. When you're talking about, for example, about China, then you would actually see that quite a lot of American investors, they would have loved to invest in China, right? Because China is a massively growing market with a lot of the trends, for example, in terms of the massive development rate of artificial intelligence, they're quite similar. But also there are more opportunities to actually, make deals which are not available anywhere else in the West. Problem is, because of the political tension, because of the trade conflicts going on, for many investors, especially, the bigger ones who are managing institutional money or, the pension fund money, it's quite difficult to invest in Chinese startups. And also, they quite quickly find that the Chinese market, it's much more closed to foreign investments than, for example, the US one, right? So, for example, if you are considering to invest in the Chinese market as a Western investor, one thing that quite a few funds do is they locate in Hong Kong, right? And through local shelves, they are trying to make deals on the mainland. But sometimes, because once again of the politics and the differences in uh, purchasing power and other things, sometimes they're not really, able to make the right deals. And also, you have to consider the fact that quite a few deals in China, just like deals in Silicon Valley, they're very overvalued, right? Because there is just quite a lot of money available in China coming from very, very late stage investors who sometimes, if it's a vertical which is growing quite rapidly, they're able to drown the vertical in money. And as a result, even if you are an entrepreneur back in China whose business perhaps, is not super stellar when it comes to the potential for international expansion, you would still be able to grow a big company in the local region. And sometimes it's just all you need, right? Because, like, for example, if you compare it to Africa, you can still, make a unicorn just by focusing on the local Chinese market. While, for example, in South Africa or in Nigeria, it's much, much more difficult.
No, because it seems you mentioned quite a lot of different regions there, but it's every time I hear, for example, about China, ride sharing apps, or actually the bike sharing apps. You now look at pictures and there's graveyards and graveyards full of bicycles because everyone kind of flooded the market, right? The potential was great. And then I also get that thing you said about how investors, they buy onto the hype. So if they see a lot of people are buying into the company, say, okay, let me also buy it, because you never know. It's hit or miss. Sometimes they actually might be very successful. What advice would you give right now to people? I wouldn't say just starting out, but they have some traction. They're trying to go to Series A's. What advice would you give them overall? Should they is there any tips or tricks you can give or something like that?
Well, look, unfortunately, Ricardo, once again, there is no golden strategy. What I would say is, do cherry pick your investors properly. So do your due diligence on them. Do try and understand what kind of smart money they bring, and do try and use the money that you raised quite responsibly, right? So don't go around buying up golden toilets. Don't go around bloating your team as much as possible. Because, for example, especially, if you are a deep tech company or hardware company, then the likelihood is, your investors would expect you to have a runway of maybe the next 12 to 18 months. And that money needs to last, right? And if you are, for example, a company in the more traditional space, then it's also quite important to spend quite a bit of your money on marketing, right? Because if you are in a market where your product is relatively understandable by both your investors and your consumers, then your moat, right, your competitive advantage is much less to do with your actual technology as it is to do with your ability to differentiate yourself in the eyes of the consumer, as well as about your business relationships and clients that you might deliver, right? Because once they start using you, then it means that, unless something goes catastrophically wrong, it is less likely that they would start using your competitor, right? At least because, of the sunk costs, right? So do have the right marketing strategy in mind. And this is especially important once maybe you're not a seed stage company, because at that stage, it's, still much more about, your product development and the hiring of your key team members. But once you are a Series A or a growth stage company, because then you've already validated your product, you've already made a few key sales, and you've already impressed a few early stage investors. So what it will take for you to actually accelerate that thing maybe 5 or 10x, right? And that's what the investors are looking for.
Interesting. Alex, I don't know, Harry, if you have any questions, but if people want to reach out to you and find you, how can they do so?
Well, sure. I mean, guys.
One thing before you jump onto that one. I know that's always a question we ask right at the end, but it was just a really, really silly question that came to mind. But it's me and Ricardo have been talking about it for ages. It's about startup scouting. I don't know. What is your view on startup scouting? Do you think it's wrong for people to be charging for introductions to VCs and vice versa? It's just a really silly one that's come up there because I just saw it pop up on a notification saying, "Oh, startup scouting's you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that." What's kind of your view on the whole startup scouting? Do you think people should charge for it or not charge for it?
Well, look. I mean, for example, how does the VC funds are also, occasionally employing startup scouts? Maybe, once again, if it's a deep tech fund, maybe they have guys, stationed in major tech universities like MIT or Stanford who are, talking to student entrepreneurs who are engaging with their local accelerators and, spotting the best. And usually, the relationship between startup scouts and VCs is not, on a fee basis. It's more, on a success basis, right? So if they did, bring a company which is great, then, perhaps they do get an opportunity to invest in that company alongside that VC fund on good terms, or, they do get a small chunk of the equity, and things like that, right? So it's usually much less commercial over the short run, because for the VC fund, it's more important that the startup scout is engaged properly over the longer run as well. Otherwise, you would get people who are flooding those funds with all kinds of startups, the majority of which would just not be relevant at all. But to answer your question about how do I feel when a startup scout approaches entrepreneurs and offers them an introduction to a VC, I personally would not believe in that very much, because ultimately, if you are an entrepreneur who does not have the right connections by himself, then it is much more meaningful for you, even though it might take longer, to actually try and generate those connections by yourself. Maybe, it can be done in multiple ways. Maybe you are, once again, going around and appearing at an acceleration program where a few angel investors or VCs are also present to potentially, invest in those companies. Maybe you are, displaying your product at some kind of, technology or conference. Maybe you are, once again, appearing at a podcast and some people get interested. And, always it's very important, especially if you're an idea stage entrepreneur where there is quite little in terms of traction or commercialization, very important to show that you have, a coherent vision, and that you as an entrepreneur, you are quite a reliable person to potentially associate with, right? So you're passionate and you're reliable, and that draws people much more than a connection by a startup scout who is always going to be on the sidelines. And ultimately, for a VC, if a startup scout came to me and said, "Hey, I have a bunch of great companies for your potential interest," ultimately I would say that the majority of the companies, they would not be relevant, and the majority of the companies we would not properly consider, because the majority of the deals that we actually end up investing in, they come from our own network, who are not startup scouts, but they are maybe partners at other funds or our own portfolio companies, or the bigger guys who are saying that, hey, we potentially could be doing an M&A with its startup at a later stage once they do validate the technology, right? So for us, it's much greater validation than some guy who wants to make a quick buck. So for you as an entrepreneur, I would say, don't get sucked into, this business of people who are trying to profit off you. Do go the longer route, but the more meaningful one.
So what platforms or tools would you use for, just say, if you're a startup trying to find all these individuals or reach out and find mentors or investors? What's kind of the best platforms? Is it just LinkedIn?
Well,
or is it?
I mean, it's very important, even at an early stage, even if you're a seed stage or like a pre-seed company, to go and build up your public presence, right? So do have your startup page in the major public databases like Crunchbase, Traction, AngelList, PitchBook, even a bunch of others. Do try and present your product at conferences. Do try and build up your LinkedIn. Obviously, it's very important to once again share your vision and to explain every time coherently as to how exactly your product is unique from your competition, and how exactly are you planning to grow it from the current point to maybe a few years time in terms of the key product features, in terms of the geographical presence and things like that. So public persona is very important, especially in the markets where there is quite a lot of competition, and as a result, there is opportunity for entrepreneurs, even if their commercialization aspect is not top notch yet, to still fundraise and to still make early introductions to potential clients.
Thank you. I'll pass it to you, Ricardo. I know you got your special words to ask.
No, I was just. I think we should actually have another episode of this because there's so much stuff we can still ask you, and it's like never ending because you. I should put this: all the startups we have, they always have questions for investors, but I think it's always hard to actually have an honest conversation and say, "Hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that?" Because there's always an angle, right? Especially if you're a startup, because you always look at, "Oh, it's an investor; they might give me money," but neither me or Harry are raising, so it's just a very honest conversation. What I would ask you at this stage is if you want to share your details, if people want to find you, and then let's definitely schedule something for an extra episode if you're willing, because that'll be great. So Alexander, if people want to find you on LinkedIn and stuff, how can they do so?
Well, Ricardo, let me just say one final thing for your startup audience, right? So, like, for example, for us as a fund, we have a deal flow funnel of startups coming to us from a huge range of sources, right? Like, for example, our investment team, they're looking at public databases. We are often going to different conferences to speak. Startups write to us. Sometimes startups write to us, just because they know we are an investor who can potentially give the money. So they're writing to us an email without, proper understanding of our investment focus. So, for example, once again, we're a deep tech fund. Some people would come to us saying, "Hey, invest in our ride-sharing startup or whatever," right? Sometimes, it's a deck which is not, properly constructed. Sometimes it's a very, very strange kind of introduction. So when you are cold mailing investors, first thing you need to prepare for is to actually have all the right, marketing materials on hand. So do, build up the right deck, and do research the funds or angel investors whom you are potentially approaching, because otherwise the likelihood is you would just be ending up in their proverbial spam folder, which is not something that you need to do. And obviously, once again, if you're not a serial entrepreneur, some cold mailing can and will probably be successful, but you just need to understand that it's not an easy or a quick process. So do your background research. And that's the thing I wanted to say, right? I mean, I would love to talk to your entrepreneur listeners, and do hit me with your crazy ideas. Happy, to stay in touch via LinkedIn. I'm sure that the guys would share it in due course. And, happy to potentially review a deck or two and, share my own opinion.
Okay, sounds good. Alexander, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So I'm just going to press stop.